My name is Scott Guthrie. I'm with the ASP Plus team, and I'm going to be talking today about sort of a whole bunch of neat ASP tips and tricks. So this is kind of an unusual session. Hopefully it'll be kind of fun. Pretty much I'm going to spend the next hour going over a whole bunch of sort of neat tips and tricks that aren't really covered in a lot of the other general sessions, or a lot of the other breakout sessions. So some neat ways you can take advantage of the product, and it's going to be drilling into sort of four key areas. A bunch of neat things in terms of our deployment architecture, specifically focusing on sort of our XCOP deployment, where we just sort of copy bits on the server and it automatically works. Look a lot at debugging, sort of how do we actually figure out once we actually put a server up on an application, how do, when there's problems, how do we actually go ahead and fix them? We've done a lot of neat things there that I think you'll like. Then we're going to look specifically at running web applications. Things like running in a web farm situation with session state. Things like handling memory leaks and deadlocks. How you can go ahead and configure that to take provide maximum uptime for users and maximum scalability. And then lastly, we're going to look at some miscellaneous other fun stuff that I think is just kind of cool that doesn't really fall into any other bucket. Things like file uploading and a few other good things that people have requested for a while. There's a lot of slides here. I have about 54. It was pretty ambitious. So I'm going to be pretty fast. I'm going to be up here afterwards if you have any questions. And I'll spend as much time as you want actually drilling in there. All the slides are now updated on CorpNet, so you can download. And I've included detailed instructions for each of the tips and tricks. So you should be able to take them, go ahead and play them with the bits that you got yesterday. Key thing is all the demos that I'm going to be showing today and all the things I'm going to be talking about, you can do at home in your hotel room or when you get back home with the CDs that you got. So first I'm going to start talking about deploying web applications. So if you went to Mark Anders' intro talk, and as well as the general sessions, you probably heard a key thing that we're sort of reiterating time and time again is we want to really simplify deployment. With ASP Plus, we introduced this notion we call XCopy deployment, which means you just copy an application up onto a server, and it just works. There's no more registration. There's no more register 32. There's no more stopping the server, both for code, for configuration now, as well as your ASPX and ASP Plus pages and services. Just copy it up on the server, and away it goes. We'll wait till the demo. So how does code deployment work? Mark talked briefly, and I'm just going to have one quick slide, and then we'll actually go into walk through steps. A number of people had some questions at his intro talk, though, about specifically, well, how does this zero registration thing work? Well, basically, what we've done with ASP Plus is we've defined this directory we call the bin directory, which is immediately underneath the application root on your IIS server. So each application can have its own bin directory. Any DLL or any .NET assembly that you copy into that directory is automatically registered for that application. And we're not updating the registry or anything. Basically, what we've done is we've basically modified the .NET loader so that whenever you try to create or compile against a class, we look in that directory to find it. Each bin directory is isolated from other applications. So each application has its own directory. Any component inside a bin directory is only available to that application. So what that means is you can actually run side-by-side applications now of the same components with the same class name. You no longer have to worry about a production server versioning problems because you can just copy your application into a separate vroot, test it out, and then flip the vroot over to point to it. And if there's a problem, you can always back it out by just pointing it at the old vroot. In terms of uninstallation, just delete the directory. There's no magic goo that's left on the system, not really updating the registry or anything like that. Just delete the directory and it's uninstalled. So specifically, what does this mean for you? How do you actually test this thing out? Well, step one, write a .NET class, compile it using either the C# or the VB compiler. And so that's CS is the C# one, VBC is the command line, or obviously you can use Visual Studio. Say I want to target a library, give it the name of the file, hit compile, you're left with a myclass.dll file. Step 2, copy it into the bin directory. Step 3, create a page that hits it. You're done. We're going to walk through that in just a second and walk through the demo. So deleting it. This is a pretty simple task. Go into the bin directory and type del myclass.dll. There's an advanced version, which if you say del star, you'll delete everything. Didn't want to put on the slides, didn't want to confuse anyone. That's deleting. So obviously installing and uninstalling things are pretty critical. On a production web server, though, you're never really deploying an app. But you deploy an app, but you kind of, there's constantly bugs. So there's constantly needs to go ahead and modify the code on a production server. Especially when you have a web farm situation, or you have a situation where your server is not on your desk. It's actually across town, locked cabinet. Today's with IS and ASP and COM, you have to go down there, you have to go to the machine, you have to stop the server because the DLLs are locked, copy over them, restart the server, and then go ahead and hit the page again. Obviously, that's a huge problem. With ASP Plus, we've introduced the notion of what we call dynamic code update. What this means is now any DLL inside the bin directory, it's a .NET assembly, if you copy over it, well, first, we no longer lock it when it's loaded in process. If you copy over it, we'll automatically detect the change. We'll automatically spin up a new instance of the app in the same process, send all new requests, drain any requests that are currently executing that old one, and then nuke the old one. There is no registration tool required. There's no utility. There's no web page you have to hit to enable it. Again, just copy over it. You're done. Zero cost, zero pain. So detailed steps, you deploy the original DLL, take a component somewhere else, make a source change to it, copy over it, you're done. Smile at how easy and cool that is. So let's actually take a look at what that means. So what I have here is a simple page called registration. It's not a very interesting page. Or basically just a very, very simple component. It's a page that's creating this component called tipstricks.myClass in VB. And it's calling a generate message method on it, passing in some random number. And I'm just going ahead and now putting the actual result inside a label. And so what does this my class look like? So it's just spitting that out. My class is actually written in C#. Very simple. Returns a string that says my number is. And here's a little batch file that I've written that invokes a C# compiler to compile that class. You'll see I'm just actually, in the target output, I'm just actually automatically sticking it inside that bin directory. So to register it, let me just recompile. Compiled it. You'll see now, here's that application view root. There's that bin directory. There's that class. I can hit it, obviously, like you've seen right there. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and modify this. Hit save. Oop. Recompile is what I meant to do. Hit refresh. You'll see the modified message is now updated. My app's not using the component. To delete this app from my system, done. So now there's nothing left on the system. I can now walk away. The bits are cleanly uninstalled. There's no more registry GRU. There's no more central thing out there that there's some turd file that I'm going to run into later on the day. It's cleaned up. Your system's clean. Well, code deployment is one aspect that we think is really critical. Obviously, the ability, to copy components is pretty central to building any serious application. Equally important, though, is configuration. Today with IIS, we store our configuration in something we call the metabase. Or the meta abyss, as some of us refer to it. It's a binary store. It's located centrally on the system, which means that you can't use any kind of text editor to edit it. You have to go through an admin tool. And the real downside, though, is that when you deploy an application onto a server, all your configuration data can't really be copied with it. You have to write some ADSI script, run it on the server to stick those settings into the metabase. And when you actually want to prepare an installation program, you've got to write some complex ADSI to sort of pull those settings down, things like security. Things like session state, as well as any custom configuration that you yourselves might have. So what we've done with ASP Plus is we introduced this thing we call XML configuration. And basically what it is, it's a file, an XML file called config.web. You can stick this at any place inside your overall URL hierarchy. You can put it at the root level of the system. You can put it at an application vroot. You can put it at a directory. And basically what it does is you can declaratively specify your XML configuration, your actual application settings within that. And the nice thing is, and they basically apply for whatever directory or URL hierarchy they're currently registered at, as well as all subdirectories within it. So if you actually stick a security setting in your application vroot that says deny access to everyone, then basically any subdirectories by default will deny access to users. Then if you drop another config.web in a subdirectory, say, oh, allow access to these 3 users, well, then only in that particular subdirectory, that'll override the parent settings. And that's what we mean when we talk about hierarchical settings. Anything you store in the config.web file, if you change it, we automatically detect it and reflect it. So you don't have to restart the system. You don't need to go in an admin tool. All you need to do is just modify the XML file, hit save, and away you go. We've stored all of our built-in ASP Plus settings, things like session state, security, compilation options, custom errors, process model, things we're going to see in a little bit, in these XML files. The neat thing is you can also store your own settings inside these XML files. So a lot of people out there probably have things like database connections and code, or they've had like sort of resource file that they try to hit. The nice thing with these XML files is you put your own DSNs, your own settings inside there, and we have a nice little API that you can get access to those as well. So we'll see some demos of that in a minute. So what I want to do here is, before I show you that DSN thing, is actually go into some of our session state settings. So I mentioned all of our session state settings are stored in the XML files. Things like timeouts, session timeouts, things like external state stores, which is sort of an interesting new thing with our farm support, which we'll get to in a little bit. The other neat thing that we now enable with our session state is something we call cookieless sessions. And so this is basically today with ASP. If you use session state, one of the things we do is we store this on the server, but we actually emit a client-side cookie that actually stores what we call a session ID, which is basically like a GUID that actually we can key off into the server to actually look up your values. The downside is the client needs to support client-side cookies, and if you don't, your session state breaks. And so a lot of people that make sure that their apps work without session state, or their apps work without cookies, are inhibited from using session state specifically because of that reason. So with ASP Plus, we introduced this notion we call cookieless sessions. It's optional. It's by default. But basically what it does, instead of storing a session ID inside a cookie, what we actually do is we munge the URL, it's called, which basically means that immediately under the app root, we inject the session ID as an additional layer. And basically we filter that out before, when the request comes in so that we can then correctly load the appropriate files off the file system. If you code your app so you have no relative links, or no absolute links to ASPX pages, or A+ pages, then basically you can just enable cookieless sessions with a simple config option. Your app will continue to work just fine. If you do have absolute paths to images, that works fine, as well as static HTML pages. The only problem you run into with cookieless sessions is if you actually point at an ASPX page and fully call it, like http:// this server /foo/ bar.aspx. To do that, then we can't automatically URL munge for you, and you have to modify your code slightly to do it for yourself. So let's actually see a demo. So how do I enable cookieless sessions? Well, create this config.web file underneath your app root. Here's what the configuration file should look like. Have a configuration open tag, have a session state tag, a little attribute that says cookieless equals true. Let's see what that looks like in a demo. So basically here I have a very simple page that I'm going to ask you to enter your name, and when you do, then I store inside the session intrinsic your actual name as well as the time that you actually updated it. And then I navigate off to a second page. And all this guy's doing is he's just spitting out those values. Now, right now, I do not have cookieless sessions enabled, which means that when I actually hit this page, I'm using a cookie on the client to store the session ID. When I say Scott, let me blow up the font so people can see in the back. I navigate off and it says, "Hi, Scott. You're stored at this time." And you'll notice, you probably can't see, but in the URL itself, and I'll show you the Cook Munch one in a second, it's just the standard URL that you're used to. But let's actually go ahead and enable cookieless sessions, because I want to make sure I work without cookies. I open up this config.web file. I'm going to change that to be true. Let's go back to the page and refresh. And what you'll notice is, here's what my URL was automatically changed to when I hit refresh. We automatically redirected, and immediately under that cookieless app name, we embedded that session ID into the URL. And then and there's that file right there. So I didn't have to do anything. We did that automatically for you. But now what happens when I enter the mark, redirect off, I go to that next page. I'm no longer using a cookie on the client to store session ID. Instead, I'm using that URL. I'm able to get back to my session state just fine. So this doesn't help you with web farms. So this now means that you can actually use session state against any browser, regardless of whether or not it supports cookies or does not. It gives you a lot more flexibility in building your apps. App settings. So as I mentioned, so all the basic ASP Plus settings stored inside that config.web file. There's also now the ability that you can store your own settings inside there. This is what we call sort of app-specific settings. What this does is it means that as you're coding your app, rather than having to hard code things like DSN entries for database connections directly inside your pages or services or even your components, you can stick them in this declarative file. And instead, then you can automatically, within your code, pull it out from that file. And what that means then is that administrators, once you deploy the machine, or developers themselves, can go ahead and tweak those settings. So examples would be like a database setting. And they can say, oh, I actually want to point off to this server, not that one. How do you do this? Well, go into that config.web file, add an app settings section. Basically, it turns out to be just a hash table. Add whatever key you want, stick whatever value you want in there. And then we're going to have a very nice, simple API. Now, this is actually, the bottom here is the API we have today. Within a page is what you have to write. It's not quite as simple as I'd like it to be. But basically, you can just pull it out and say, oh, give me the DSN, programmatically return that value for you. The really neat thing is if you're in a production app and you're running, and you modify that config.web file and hit save, well, the next time the code requests it, they'll get the modified version. So we do all the file change notification for you. Provide you a much cleaner way you can go ahead and abstract your code. Let's see a quick demo of that. What I'm going to do is, Mark showed you first day, this is sort of the iBuySpy application. So what I'm going to do right here is xcopy deploy this app setting directory. So I'm copying that iBuySpy application into the directory. That includes the components. You see the bin directory there, as well as the configuration. Now, simply by copying that app, hitting it, it's a big app, so it's piling lots of stuff. You'll notice I've now installed that app. There's nothing more required. As I go around and pull stuff up, I'm hitting stuff from a database. Now, the neat thing is if I go inside that directory, one of the things you'll notice is inside that config file, that's actually where I'm storing the database connection for this entire iSpy app. So if I want to go ahead and I have a couple machines, deploy the database on a different machine, I don't need to go ahead and modify the code all over the place. All I need to do is modify that one string. Hit save, I'm done. And if it's a production app, it'll automatically detect the changes and switch over to use the new one. So it provides a much simpler way for you to actually store your settings in a much cleaner way so that administrators can take advantage of it. Debugging web applications. So deployment, we've made a lot of really great strides in terms of just making it super simple to copy bits onto a machine, have them go up and run. Not require local access, not require any reboots or any resets whatsoever. Looking at challenges that people have today with ASP, obviously one of them. Another big one, though, is debugging. There's obviously a debugger, and we'll show a debugger demo in a little minute. But more generally, just sort of how do I know what happens when my app starts breaking? How do I know what the problem is? How many people today use response.writes as their primary debugging mechanism with ASP? You're going to like this one then. So with ASP Plus, we introduced this thing we call tracing. Specifically for all of you that use response.writes as your primary debugging mechanism. The idea with tracing is, basically there's now a new intrinsic on the page called trace. And there's two methods on it. One's called warn, one's called write. And basically you can write into that trace object, sort of like you would with response.write, just fine. The neat thing is, if tracing is not enabled, those words become no ops, and they go nowhere. Enable tracing, and you can actually, then you'll see the output. So it provides a very clean way for you to go ahead and structure your code. So to add the trace settings, to enable tracing, all you do is you say page trace equals true. Those two lines of code, trace.write, trace.warn, hit a page from the browser. Let's actually see what a demo of that looks like. So what I have here is a very simple page, doing some database access, and I'm populating a what we call data list. With some values here. Now, say, for example, I want to do things like, well, let me actually store the value that I'm going to go, I want to do some sort of response.write-like behavior. You can do response.write still, obviously. What I'm going to do instead here is I'm going to say trace.warn. And I give it a little category, which is basically a way you can sort things on. And I'm going to say category is, and I'm just going to pull out the value that was actually entered on the client. Let's hit this page again. Seems to be working identically. Adding that trace statement didn't do anything. Well, let's enable tracing and see what happens when I do tracing. So it's basically just a no-op right now. At the top of the page, though, I say trace equals true. You'll notice that in addition to processing the regular request, at the bottom of the HTML, I'm now dumping out trace information. Now, this trace information includes things like the session ID, the time the request actually came in, what the status code was, type of request in terms of HTTP verb it was, trace information. Specifically, we have timings now for the various stages in the request processing. So if you want to identify, generally where's the bottleneck on my page, here's that custom message that I just emitted. Scott Goog, category is business. So now I can actually go ahead and watch in the sort of chronological order what's happening on my page. I can say, like, oh, in this event handler, the value was here, called off into this function, wrote it out, this value there. So I can now sort of chronologically see what's going on. I can actually look at the control hierarchy tree. So if I'm using server control, I can actually see what controls are being created. This third column here is kind of neat. It's called render size. This actually tells you how many bytes each of those controls actually emits to the content page. So if you want to try to identify, I want to cut down on the overall payload size, take a look at that column. This fourth column is something that Eric Olson's going to go into more detail, the cache talk a little bit, or performance talk a little bit later, but this is basically view state. This is the amount of state management that's actually being round-tripped between when you have rich server controls like labels that can't automatically round-trip their values inside in controls. Down here you can see our cookies collection, what cookies read there. See the headers collection, what headers were sent. The forms collection. So, for example, if you have either a query string or a form post, you can actually look at specifically, here are the values that were sent from the client. And then lastly, you can actually query the server variables of the system. Particularly Proud of that feature. The neat thing is that once you disable it, everything that you did in terms of a trace gets automatically nulled out. It just basically becomes a no-op. Even at compilation time, we actually strip out those statements. If you want to know at runtime whether or not tracing is in fact enabled, you can actually, the trace.isEnabled property to check on the page. So if you want to actually do an expensive calculation, you can just scope it by the trace.isEnabled block and go ahead and do it. Now, this is somewhat interesting. But I know a number of you are going, oh, but it kind of throws all this crap at the bottom of the page. Yeah, it's better than response.write, but come on, you can do better than that. I can hear you. So what we've done is we've enabled application level tracing. And the neat thing with this is basically we don't actually emit the output at the bottom of the page. Instead, we gather it up. And so you can actually look at aggregates over requests in terms of what's happening. And then there's sort of if you enable it, a magic URL inside the app that you can hit, and then you can go through and actually then pull up the details about each one of those. And what that means is that your end user, say for example your test guy who sits down and is going to go ahead and play with the app, isn't going to see all the tracing input. They're actually going to see what the app feels like. You as the developer can actually go ahead and look at what they did. So let's actually see what that means. So I have this page, just like before. Okay. I'm going to create a file called that config.web file in that directory. I'm going to say trace enabled equals true. Refresh. Go ahead, use this app. You're going, where's tracing stuff? Well, let's actually set up a new instance of the browser. And basically, we have a URL called trace.axd that if I hit immediately under the app root, actually hits the tracing application. Oops. Oh, did I do that? Okay. Thank you very much, actually. You know about this more than I do. So here's this tracing application. You can see now, as I'm making requests, hit refresh here, it's adding additional entries into the tracing app. If I want to click the details of any request, click there, and I actually see the details. So this gives you a way you can actually say, well, how is the user really using it? And so you can actually look at aggregate totals to see sort of, oh, well, they're hitting this, and then they're hitting that, and, oh, you know, let me optimize this particular stuff over other things. One option inside that tracing is this thing we call the request limit, and that's actually the number of individual tracing steps that we'll actually maintain before you have to hit a reset button on that trace app. So, for example, we'll actually store up to 10 entries now on this thing. If I hit clear current trace, we'll actually null it out. So you can actually configure that to be as large a number as you want. Default is 10. One important aspect. Don't tracing on by default. So don't put this in a production app and deploy it. There is a certain performance penalty associated with having it, so be a little careful with that. Debugging. How many people use the debugger today with ASP? Yeah, that's about as many as I thought. So the debugger with ASP is a little limited today in a couple of ways. Several ways. Couple big there's some things that's just sort of not a great debugger about, just because it's just not a great debugger. Other things that are sort of downsides with it though are you can't actually debug between languages. So you can actually have a VB script page that calls into a VB component that calls into a C++ component. With our current offerings in VS6, you'd have 3 separate debuggers that you need to use. The script debugger, the VB debugger, the C++ debugger. VS7, as well as sort of the .NET framework, we now have a way you have a unified debugger that we can actually debug cross languages, and we can do simple debugging within an ASP Plus app. So for example, right here, a simple page or simple app, sort of a database entry app, sort of similar to that one we just saw with the tracing example. Enter your name. I don't need to enter my name. Hit enter, we go off, hit a database, and populate some values. Pretty simple. So how do I actually go ahead and debug this, though? Let's say, for example, I specifically want to know, before we hit the database, let's actually walk through the database code in terms of what happened. With VS7, go into my source, and so this is actually my page source. F9 to hit a breakpoint. I'm going to go ahead and hit F5, recompile, bring up the app, attach the debugger. Now what will happen is when I hit enter, I'm going to do a submit back to the server. I'm going to break in that location. So the debugger automatically attached, automatically broke. And in that location, I have tons of information. So many ways I can look at the call stack, watch window, see the full list of windows, breakpoints, exception lists, autos, locals, this, watch, immediate, threads, what modules are being loaded. I can actually disassemble things. Very detailed. Now, what I'm going to do right here, though, is in my code, notice I'm creating a business object called BizObject. And I'm calling down here mybiz.getData. One of the really neat things about this debugger is that this is a business component. It's compiled. Now I'm going to, right on this line, I'm about to call it. Now I'm going to step into it. So I can now debug and basically step from my page into my components back to bin seamlessly. You'll notice also here in the call stack window, unfortunately very small, so probably a lot of people can't see. It shows me what language my component was written in. I can debug seamlessly from VB to C# to manage C++. If you have Visual Studio, you can also debug into either ATL components or anything generated with existing C++. That's sort of not based on the .NET framework, but basically we have seamless debugging between the two. I can also jump, using this little window, you'll notice I can actually jump up and down the call stack from where I currently am at. Step over stuff. Step out, my page renders. So hopefully a more powerful way that you can go ahead and actually debug your applications and sort of hopefully dramatically simplify nailing down some of those really difficult debugging issues. And so the big step here to enable this, your config.web file, you add a compilation debug mode equals true attribute. VS does this automatically. Then you attach these into debugger, set the breakpoints, and hit the page. Now, I mentioned VS, and I demoed VS. We actually ship with a standalone debugger that you got on Wednesday, in addition to the VS one you got on Wednesday, called debug URT, or debug URT. It actually ships outside of VS, and is basically based on the same code as the VS. It doesn't have all the shell integration. But that's sort of a screenshot of what that looks like right there. So with or without VS, you can now do debugging. Error handling. So say you debug your entire app. Well, let me step back first. .NET Common Language Runtime now supports a unified exception language. So Anders talked about that a little bit on Tuesday. What this now means is there's no more H results. There's no more sort of different languages exposing different ways to raise and report errors. Now any language can throw an exception, and any language can catch an exception. This includes VB, which now supports try-catch blocks. It makes it a lot easier for you inside your code to go ahead and handle errors appropriately. Now, the reality, though, is that no matter how much you do in terms of handling errors inside code, there's always going to be some problems that occur in the system. Either problems that you just can't sort of handle in a try-catch block. That you don't want to end up showing a stack trace to a user. You want to show a nice, consistent message with your own logo that sort of says, hey, there was a problem with the app, or the app's unavailable. Please try again later. And so what we've done with ASP Plus is try to provide a really simple way that you can introduce what we call declarative error handling within your application. So that the goal is you never show an ugly, 0x8889004 error message to your user. Instead, you have sort of a very nice, easy page. So this custom error feature of ASP Plus, basically what the idea is, inside your config.web file, you can add a section we call custom errors. And basically within custom errors, what you do is you specify a URL that we redirect the browser to in the event that any unhandled error occurs inside your application. You can actually, within there, you can have a sort of what we call default error page, which means for all, any error, go here. Then we can have subtags, which actually specify specific error pages to show for different status codes. For example, like 404, you can say, call your administrator for access. 403, which means 404 means the page isn't there. So you can say, sorry, that request is not, resource is not there. 403, you could say, sorry, you don't have access to it. So you can go ahead and customize it based status codes. And you can actually then customize each custom error section, so you can have for the entire app have it per URL. So what does this look like? Well, let's go through a demo. Go back to that iBuySpy app. Maybe bump font down a little bit. Okay, so we have this application. It's obviously very, very database-centric. And so what I'm going to do is sort of simulate a little possible problem that can occur, which is your database server goes offline. So I'm basically just going to pause my SQL server, hit a page, boom, you'll see a nice little stack trace that comes up. It says, your server's been paused, you can't execute. And that's just sort of the error message that's returned from ADO. With ASP Plus, we now provide a detailed stack trace at the bottom of each error message that actually shows you specifically, here's the call stack. The feature we just checked in, which I think is really, really cool, that unfortunately didn't make it onto the CDs that you got yesterday, but you'll see shortly, is that we can now actually determine from any exception, when you're in debug mode, the original file and line number, where the exception actually occurred. So if you actually have a null reference exception, that's true for both pages as well as business components. If you have a business component that goes and calls into ADO, and you have a null reference exception or kind of exception that occurs on some random line inside that component, we'll actually, in the error message, show you not only the line number, we'll actually show you the 3 lines before and after that code that actually generated that exception. So it should make it much, much easier for you to very quickly determine what the problem is. It's only for debug mode. It isn't enabled for production sites, obviously, for security reasons. But it should make debugging a lot easier. But anyway, regardless of that, I don't want to ever see any error message like this to my user. Instead, what I want to do is I want to say, hey, sorry, the application's down, offline, unavailable. So how do I do that? Well, let's go into that config.web. The bottom here, you'll see I have a custom errors section already defined. This is errorpage.htm. Now, custom errors right now is off. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to enable it. Hit save. Let's hit that page again. What you'll notice is we detected the custom errors was enabled, saw the unhandled exception occurred, we're automatically showing this nice error message now instead of that ugly stack trace. So your users now see, there's something wrong with the server, I'll come back later, and your app looks much more polished and much more professional. The nice thing is because this is stored inside your config.web file, you can X-copy it up onto a server. You don't need to go ahead and IIS and tweak anything to enable it. So one thing that's sort of neat about this is that you hide the error messages from your users. Now, obviously, one of the problems, though, is if you're a developer, how do you actually go about and see what the problem actually is so that you can actually debug it yourself? Well, we have 2 ways to do that, or one way to do that. And that has a neat little option on this custom error. So we have on mode, we have off mode, that enables it, disables it, and we have a mode we call remote only. The idea with remote only is if I hit this thing now, let's go back to the page that caused the error. I'm actually going to see the stack trace again. Well, why are we doing that? Well, the reason is I'm hitting with localhost. If I actually go ahead and hit it remotely from a different machine, so let's actually hit it with the IP address of the actual box here. We'll treat this as an external user. Well, I have to actually, unfortunately, be on a different machine. I don't take my word for it. Basically, what we'll do is we'll actually show you the custom error page. So if you're local, you get to see the exception. If you're remote, you'll actually see the nice custom error page. So, if it's, sorry, the same file? Oh, didn't I? Oh. Well, but thank you for pointing that out. So, we're sort of on a strange network, so I'm not exactly sure what's going on. So, custom errors give you a really nice way you can basically hide the error message. The remote-only view gives you a nice way that, when a problem occurs, worst comes to worst, you can run over to the machine and actually see the stack trace in person. Downside is, how do you know when something's going wrong? How do you know when your customer says, until your customer calls up and says, hey, your server's offline, or I'm getting some weird errors, how do you actually detect that? So with AP Plus, we've introduced this new thing we call the application error event. It's an event within global.sax, and basically what you can do is use it. It'll actually get raised in the event that any unhandled error occurs anywhere within the application. So immediately before the custom errors page gets invoked, this event handler gets called. And you can go ahead and write whatever your code you want inside there to go ahead and trap that error and do something appropriate with it. For example, we now have event log support with the .NET framework. Nice, simple API you can use from any language to go ahead and write something to the event log. So for example, let's actually see what this means. Let's go into this app. I create a global.asax file. I'm going to cheat. And I just copy and paste this. What I'm doing right here is I'm going to, in that application error event, I'm going to actually specify the log name. Let's call this a PDC. I actually can go check to see if the iBuySpy_PDC event log was actually already created on this system. If it hasn't, I'm going to go ahead and create that new event log. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to write an entry to it. And this entry is going to consist of the URL of the page that caused the exception, as well as the actual exception stack trace itself. So we'll hit this page. Yes. Still getting errors. Go to the event log now. You'll see I now have an iBuySpy PDC event log there. I have 2 error messages inside of it. Let me double click. You'll see within here, it's probably only 2. Let's actually just blow it up. Copy and paste it. Notepad. Kind of messed up the formatting. But basically, what you should be able to see is that I have the URL right here, a page that caused the error, and there's the actual exception stack dump right there itself. The advantage now is you can just look at the event log to see what's happening on the server. With App Center, you can actually set up automatic email notification so that you can actually get paged or sent email as soon as an item gets written into that event log. The nice thing with the NT event log is that you can actually, from a remote machine, go ahead and view it. So if you're an administrator, you don't have to be local on the machine to look at those entries inside the event log. Just hit the box, hit refresh. You can actually see if there's any new entries that have been added log. In addition to things like errors, you can do information events. You can say, oh, getting a lot of weird security attempts. hacker attempt somewhere else, handle it that way. That's one way to notify it to the NT event log. I mentioned with App Center, you can go ahead and automatically detect when something gets written to the event log, send an email, do something like that. Well, the other thing you could do, obviously, then is just send the email directly from within ASP+. The ASP+, we're introducing a new SMTP mail component. It's very, very simple, very, very easy to use. Basically, you say, create new message, set the to, set the from, set the subject. You can optionally set the body format. By default, it's just text. We now support HTML encoding as well. So if you actually want to say in an HTML page, you can. Set the body. Optionally, you can actually attach files as well. Then hit send, and away it goes. And so I'm not actually in CorpNet, so I can't actually show you. I can send the mail, but it's not going to get there. I can copy paste this code within an application, and now I'm actually going to go ahead and get email notification when problems occur. Now, obviously, you can use the component in a variety of other useful scenarios. Sorry? Yes. So to use this component, you do need to have the SMT service that comes with Windows 2000 installed. It's now actually installed by default on Win2K servers. It's something you have to manually, or you have to explicitly choose to install on professional editions. So once you're running, so we have a way we can detect the problems. Well, there's still, and ways to debug them, ways to deploy apps. There's still probably, as you're running apps, though, potential problems that you're going to run into. How many people have ever had an IIS server crash with ASP? Only 2, 3, okay. 4, 5 people. Doesn't happen very often. Well, can happen sometimes. But it's often, there's a real pain. You have your ASP app and it's persistently crashing for some reason. You can't figure out exactly why. Well, with ASP+, we automatically provide access violation crash protection, which means if something crashes, we'll automatically restart ASP+, and your users will be completely uninterrupted. We do not run ASP+ anymore inside the INET info IIS process. Specifically, yeah. Better yet, one of the reasons why we did that is we've actually improved the performance of out-of-proc performance so that it's actually now within 5% of in-proc. So there's actually not in addition to the reliability benefit, there's no longer a performance penalty in terms of doing that. In addition to providing support for crash protection, ASP+ now supports memory leak detection as well as deadlock detection. This means if you have sort of a persistent leak inside, we can automatically detect it, and once the leak gets beyond a certain threshold, we'll automatically create a new process, get ASP+ up and running, get your app running, start sending requests to it, drain requests from the old process, and then terminate it. So that you don't actually have to restart the machine and the server doesn't crash. Also with deadlocks, if you have 2 threads, they both compete for 2 critical resources, they grab them locks and grab them in the reverse order and run into a deadlock situation. We now have a way that you can actually detect and say, well, if some thread hasn't returned after, say, 10 minutes. There's some deadlock situation, there's some threads intertwined. Let's go ahead and restart the process. So how do we do that? Well, to handle deadlocks, you basically go to the config.web on the root file of the system. And there's an IIS process model attribute there. You set what we call a request queue limit. Basically what this means is if the number of requests queue up beyond this certain time, we basically infer that something is wrong with the server because it's just not processing any more requests. We'll automatically reset the process. Set that one setting, you now have deadlock protection. Handling memory leaks. Well, there's another attribute called memory limit. Basically, this is a percentage. And we're probably going to rename the attribute because you can't really figure any of that out from looking at it. But basically, it's a percentage of the virtual memory size for that system. And basically, we say if process starts taking up more than 75% of the virtual memory size of the system, there's something wrong. We're going to go ahead and automatically reset it, start it up again. Let's actually see a demo of that. So what I'm going to do here is open up a config file for the root level of the system. I'm going to change my memory limit to be something smaller like 8, just so I can we're not here all day. And what I'm going to do here is run this page called memleak.aspx. Now, we now live in a garbage collected system. So you might think, well, there's no such thing as memory leaks. And the reality is there's not memory leaks in the sense that we know them today. Instead, what can happen, though, is, although we, won't have memory leaks in terms of, memory will get released or will get removed as it's released correctly. But you can still run into problems where I have some buffer, I'm storing an application state, and I just keep adding crap into it over and over and over again. It's just bigger and bigger and bigger. That's not a leak. It's not, it's not like some random bit of memory that we've lost touch with. But the reality is your process memory size is going to continue to grow and grow and grow and run into problems. So what I have here is a very simple page. I just hit it, and basically I put a string into it about 100,000 times. And I store this thing in application state. So as I hit it subsequent times, the thing gets bigger and bigger and bigger. I just keep appending information. The last thing I'm just doing here is using the system.diagnostics space, which has a whole bunch of neat utilities so that now I can actually get information about the current process that I'm in. So I'm actually going to print out the process ID here, as well as the virtual memory size of the process. Notice I've enabled, so I said after 8%, I should reset this process. That's the memory size. Hit refresh again. It's growing, growing. And notice the process ID is about to change, I think. System is slowly grinding. Yeah, so you'll notice, for example, there, the process ID was automatically reset. Doesn't make a great demo scenario because I should mention that we actually only check at 10-second intervals. That's why you can sometimes take a second, sometimes take up to 10 seconds. And so we just sort of monitor the process at that sort of increment. And so that's process detection enabled for you automatically. And just because I think I already still have a buffer in there, let me just reset it. So in addition to sort of automatically detecting when failures occur, release, deadlocks, crashes, we also have realized, looking at other web servers out there like Apache, a very successful model where they sort of say, well, I know there's going to be bugs, I know there's going to be problems. Rather than try to respond when the problem occurs, I'm going to proactively at a periodic level flush myself and reset. And so Apache has this model where you can actually say after 5,000 requests, just do the process and restart it automatically, irrespective of whether there's a memory leak, whether there's a crash, whether there's a deadlock. Just sort of periodically purge the system. So with ASP Plus, we've borrowed that concept, and we've introduced what we call preemptive cycling. This sort of eliminates the need for administrators to sort of kick the system once a week just because they go, if I don't, it crashes in the next couple of days anyway. You can now do the time-based. You can say after a certain number of minutes, you can actually automatically reset the system. Or you can request-based, which means after n number of requests, reset the system automatically. To enable that with time-based, set this attribute called timeout and get a number of minutes you want where you want to reset the process. To do request cycling, you set it as the number, and you say the number of requests that you want before we actually terminate the process. See a quick demo of that. So I'm going to set this to be, go back to 75 there. You can use these in combination with each other, and I'm going to say request limit 4 or 3. Again, we actually check only every 10 seconds. So it might be slightly more than 3. But you'll notice now 1828 is the process ID of my process. Automatically reset the process for us, purge any problems that we have before they actually occur. Ooh. Now you're probably going though, like, well, I guess that's interesting. But like, how does my app work if you just sort of like reboot it every 10 or 3 requests? The reality is 3 requests is kind of it's not going very well is the answer. But even every 10,000 requests every day if I reboot it. What happens? Doesn't it mean I have to recompile everything when I reboot? Well, the answer is no. Not in the bits that you get Wednesday, so there's a slight caveat there. But now with ASP Plus, we actually do persist results of our compilations to disk. So that if you reboot the process, you reboot the machine, or reset it for any reason, we no longer have to recompile all your files when they get accessed again. What this means is now if you have like a large app, let's say like Microsoft.com, where they might have 10,000 pages, they reboot the server, they actually see a period like half an hour to 45 minutes when, new users are hitting this page and they have to sort of dynamically recompile their scripts with ASP. With ASP Plus, you don't need to do that. We automatically pick it up immediately. What this means is you should see dramatically improved startup time for your server. Instead of taking a couple seconds to reboot, it should be almost instantaneous on a production system. Well, what about state? So that solves resources, but what about session state? How do I actually preserve that across requests? With ASP Plus, we're now introducing this notion we call external state. This can be stored either in what we call the ASP state Windows NT service, which is basically a NT service you can run either on your local machine or on a remote machine that basically will automatically store your state for you. Alternatively, you can store it inside SQL servers. You point us at a SQL server, we'll actually store it inside of there. So if you actually want to do like Wolfpack clustering and sort of better reliability of your state service, that second option is going to give you some extra benefits. Big reliability wins. This now means if your process crashes, your state's not lost. And it means now you can actually distribute session state in a web farm. You can actually take the state store, stick it on another machine, point multiple front-end web servers at it, and as long as you have the same name from a DNS entry, so you do DNS round robin or use App Center or use Cisco Local Director, your state will automatically be distributed across the machines within an app. So let's see a demo of that. Yeah. So how do you enable external session state? Well, first I'm going to show you local on my machine. What I'm going to do is basically inside my config.web, I'm going to set the session state attribute called inproc, and I'm set to be false. And I'm going to say server equals localhost. So I'm going to run the state store local on my own little box there. So let's go back and let's set this request limit here back to be 3, shall we? And let's go to process model. SAM, session state. So I have a very simple little page here, session state 1. It's just like that last one we saw with cookieless sessions, except it's not cookieless. But basically what I'm going to do here, Scott, storing something in session state. You'll notice, though, as I'm going around here, boom, what happened? Well, we have that process model cycling going on in the background. And so when we get the process, by default right now, my session state is still in memory. It was lost. So how do we fix that? Well, let's go ahead and enable external session state. Step 1, I'm going to say net start ASP state. That starts the ASP state service on this local machine. Open up my config.web file here. Inproc equals false. Hit save. Go back and run that app again, the demo again. Let's put in name suggestions, Peter, Paul. Not all at once. There we go. Okay, so now we're actually hitting the same app. This time, though, my session state's external. So let's see what happens when the process ID changes. The state is maintained. State is maintained across resets. So, Greg, if we switch to the other machines now, we're actually going to go, and what I'm going to show now is, let's actually see it working, though, remotely. You have 2 machines. Let's store the session state on one of the machines, separate from the actual worker process to see what happens. So I'm going to set inproc equals false. What I'm doing is I'm pointing on server. I'm pointing at a remote IP address. Just to prove it right here. You can see there it is right there. So what I'm going to do, I configure that app as basically the same app. Go to another machine. So that's hitting a remote machine, the worker process in it, but it's actually going off to a remote state store. The state's being maintained. So now your session state now works across the network. Now I don't have multiple machines pointing at it, but basically if I had two machines pointing at this, I could easily DNS round robin between them, Cisco local director between them, use App Center to go between them. Anything I want, I can now actually scale my app out just fine across a cluster. Just to prove this is real, let's reset this IIS machine that I'm actually hitting. Manually restart it. Go back. Hit refresh. Process ID changed, my state's maintained. This is unfortunately going to take a while, so we're going to move on, but let's just reboot the machine and see what happens in about 5 minutes when we come back and make sure the state's still there. So if we could actually go back to the laptop for the moment. So we're shutting down the system. Say there was a crash or something, and let's just make sure the state's maintained. It's kind of risky. I hope it will. So we can switch back to the laptop machine. Great. Okay, so we're back on my laptop. So we're going to move on to session state now. Go on a few other cool things. But we're going to come back to that, and we'll see how that machine's progressing. It's checking its disk. Wonderful. So we might come back to that machine. So what I'm going to do right here is actually quickly show you a few other tricks in the last few minutes that we have. Step 1, ASP plus quick starts. We've actually done, you saw iBuySpy demoed by Mark the other day. You might have seen it from Susan. For those of you who haven't been there, I highly recommend that you go to www.ibuyspy.com. And on here, we're basically running iBuySpy. There's some documentation that you can read. You can run this. You can run either the VB or the C# version. I mentioned we now have sort of Xcopy deployment. We now have side-by-side. So we have two versions of the app running side-by-side in the same process on the same machine. Go to any of these pages, hit View Source. You'll actually see sort of a nice 1 or 2 page description. And pull up the color-coded source of the particular page that you're on. Shows you all the server controls, highlights all ANGA code, as well as the code there. We also have at the top all your business components, your pagelets, and your stored procedures. And we also have it inside the code. So, for example, if I want to see, well, I'm going to call the get products, click here. We'll actually navigate into the business component, show you your business component, click here, and we'll navigate and we'll show you your stored procedure. So it's a great way you can play around with the app and learn sort of a nice case study of how we recommend that apps are built with the new platform. We also, though, have this thing we call the Quick Start. And this is installed, this is available on your CD. Also, I should mention also iBuySpy. You can download the apps directly so you can install them on your local machine to play around with them as well. There's a little link up there. The Quick Starts is another way to learn a lot about the product. We have about 400 samples, all categorized. So you can say like, oh, I want to know how to do data binding, or say data access and customization. Click any of these samples. Ooh. Oh, I got to start the server again, don't I? It's proven it's real. Run any of these samples. You can sort of shows you sort of nice little discrete things that you can play around with, discrete ways to build stuff. So you can sort of say, oh, how exactly do I do just this? And we have a little sample that explicitly shows you just that. And all the code is available in both VB and C#. We also have a couple of big apps down here, one of which is called the Class Browser. Anders did a great job on Tuesday talking about how we now have this sort of unified class hierarchy of classes that you can take advantage of. So one question is, well, how do you learn about that? Well, one way is with this class browser that you can run as part of the Quick Start. Basically, the class browser shows you on the left-hand side a set of namespaces, things like drawing, things like data, things like system.web, which is where ASP Plus lives. Clicking on those namespaces And on the right-hand side, then you'll actually go ahead and see the classes and interfaces defined within namespaces. Click one of those, go ahead and we'll actually pull up the details, constructors, properties, methods, the complete hierarchy of the object model, as well as anything that inherits it. The neat thing is this is done dynamically. We're using reflection at runtime to actually introspect the capabilities of these classes. There's a config.web file in that class browser directory, so you can add your own components into the list so you can actually walk through those as well. So it's a very, very useful app to sort of figure out what are the capabilities of the overall platform, what the object model, everything look like. File upload. So this is a request that people have had for a long time and finally delivered. ASP Plus now provides full file upload support. We accomplish this through two ways. There's two APIs that you can go ahead and take advantage of this with. One is there's now request.files collection. If you actually have a form, you say enc type equals multipart mime slash, I'll show you in the next page. You can now say, just like you can request that query string request.form, request.file, my file, and get access to the uploaded file. We also have a friendly server control called input type equals file that actually you can just drop on a page and program directly against it. Both the files collection as well as the server control cough up what we call HTTP posted file class that basically encapsulates the posted file information. You can upload multiple files at once. This one, each one has its own class that you can actually operate against. And here's the various methods and properties of that object look like. First thing's the input stream. This basically gives you a raw stream access to the contents of the file. If you want to apply some kind of transform before writing it to disk, well, you have a stream so you can go ahead and do it. As Anders mentioned, all of our APIs now support a common stream API. So whether you're doing classes, whether you're doing ASP Plus, or whether you're doing file I/O, now just anything can work against a stream can consume any stream written by anyone else. We have content length and content type, tells you how long it is, how big it is, and the actual MIME type is of the thing that was posted. File name tells you sort of the file name of the thing that was posted. And we also have a friendly save as method. What the save as method does is you give it a file location on your local server, and we'll automatically save it out to disk for you. So here's a little sample. Basically, I have a little form, enc type equals multipart slash form data. Dropping on a little server control called upload file, type equals file, run a server. A little button. You click the button, I didn't say upload file, posted file, save as. I'm saying save it to the foo.txt direct file. And what file that was in that input type equals file, when you posted it up, will get saved to that location. Pretty simple. Let's see a demo. Particular file guide does. Click the browse. This is sort of standard. It works with any browser. In the last 2 or 3 years. I'm going to select an image to upload. Upload me. What this little guide does is it basically uploads this image that I selected off my hard drive, storing it on the server, and it's just generating a link to the little cat. And so that's sort of simple file upload. It'll be on the news group, so you can go ahead and take advantage of it. So file upload in and of itself is pretty rich capability. You can actually do a lot of interesting things with it. Lets you build a lot more interesting apps. Another neat little feature I want to highlight before we go is image generation. A lot of people have requested the ability to actually do some sort of image generation on the server, generate charts, generate bitmaps, generate JPEGs, generate GIFs. With System.drawing, or GDI Plus as it's also known as, we now provide a very rich API that lets you actually generate images, crop images, resize images, rotate images, take an image and overlay additional text or pictures on top of it. The nice thing is that you can just write it out either the file system, or you can use the stream APIs, ASP Plus, to stream it back to the server, to the client. If you want to do a stock quote service, you can go ahead and easily do it. What I'm going to do right here take a slightly modified version of that one you just saw. I'm going to upload that cat into the server, but this time I'm going to set the image height. I'm going to dynamically on the server then resize the image. Fortunately, our process model still enables, that's why it's a little slow. It's restarting every 2 clicks. Let's just say a little caption here. Size 62. And what I'm doing right there is I'm basically taking that image on the disk that was resized, and I'm drawing using system.drawing onto the original image, then saving it back out to disk. So this is not like HTML right here. This is actually a real JPEG being generated. And here's what the code to do that will look like. So again, file upload, the buttons like I showed in the other source. Then down here I have in a little panel hidden to begin with, I have a couple text boxes and a couple drop-down lists. Basically, when you hit the upload button, and I'm just calling system.drawing.image, I'm loading the image, creating the image directly from the actual input stream that was saved, so I didn't have to write it to disk here. Creating a bitmap, saving it to Step 2, when I update then, is basically I'm loading it from disk. I'm resizing it. I'm drawing some text on it, and then you see down there actually say get thumbnail. And I'm just specifying in the height and width coordinates, or height and width parameters that were specified. So this is written in C#, and I'm saving it back out to disk. It's pretty simple to do. You can have lots of fun with it. It's a neat little chip and trick to play around with. So summary. So unfortunately, we only had an hour. So there are literally hundreds of cool new features to play around with ASP+. Try to give you a little sampling in a number of different areas that you might not see in other parts of the talks. Please use the quick start, look at iBuySpy, and stay tuned. There's more and more tips and tricks that you can take advantage of, a lot more that you can do. Other places that you can check is the number of sites have gone live, ASP Plus community sites. We worked with these guys a few weeks in advance. So Learn ASP, ASP-NG, Next Generation ASP, ASP 101, and ASP Free are now all live ASP Plus sections. All the quick starts are available online as well as iBuySpy from them. And there's a bunch of discussions and forum groups that you can join. Go ahead and discuss ASP Plus and share some features and ideas with yourself. So if there's any questions, if not, thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.